Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, we are glad to inform you that from today onwards we are starting a very new series, and this series is on history of English literature. In the first session today, or I would say as a whole, we would be talking on the Anglo-Saxon period, and in the first session we would be discussing on the origin of English, whereas in the second half we would be discussing on the origin of Old English. And for this very discussion on the Anglo-Saxon period, we have once again with us in our studios Professor Bhimsen Dahiya. Professor Bhimsen Dahiya is a former Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University, as well as he has taught literature in English for decades in India and abroad in various universities. As well as I would like to tell you all, there are several books to his credit on Anglo-American literature and at a higher level also. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Dahiya and let's understand under his able guidance the Anglo-Saxon period. As I told you earlier, first of all we would be discussing on the origin of English. So I would like to welcome our guest Professor Bhimsen Dahiya. Professor Dahiya, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning everybody, and we begin this series of lectures on history of English literature. Obviously, the beginning has to be the origin of language, origin of literature, how the whole thing came up. As you know, in ancient times, before the death of Christ, in those centuries, there were no national boundaries, and there were just groups, tribes of people, all warriors, slave keeping, fighting among each other, and whoever wins will occupy that territory. So no boundaries, and mostly the stay of these tribes will not be permanent, because fresh tribes will come, they will attack, again wars will take place, and whoever wins will rule. The relation between knowledge and power has been very intimate, as Michael Foucault, one of the very influential literary critic today, he wrote on the subject, the relationship between power and knowledge, and he says it is very intimate relationship. After all, it is power that determines the kind of knowledge that we have, particularly language. We can look to our own history of India. In ancient times, Sanskrit was the language of the people here, because the Sanskrit speaking people, they were in power. So whoever is in power will impose their own language, and everybody then starts speaking, using, writing, reading that language. After that, when the Muslim period begins, then we have Persian, because they came from there, Persia. So their language was Persian. So in India, Persian became the official language. And out of that interaction between Persian language and Sanskrit came out Hindi, Urdu, and so many other languages. So that is how languages are born. The same is the case with English. The island of England in ancient times was governed by tribes, the earliest tribe known before the death of Christ were the Celts, Celts, Celts and Gaels, Gaels. These two tribes and their various, say, variants, they invaded the island of England and they ruled it for many centuries. So the language of the Celts was Celtic and the language of the Gaels was Gaelic. So it were these languages which were spoken before the death of Christ, Celtic and Gaelic. Now, then new tribes will come, they will dislodge these ones and establish their own languages. So the language will change, but ultimately every language leaves behind its impact on the speech of people, on their lives, on their literature whenever it comes about. All these things keep accumulating. One language group comes, the other goes out, another comes, then the older one goes out, so on and so forth. It goes on. But every group of people leave behind something of their language and something of their culture. For example, close to the end of the ancient period, means 1st century BC, England was attacked by the Romans. Julius Caesar, a very familiar figure, he attacked England in 54 BC, first time. Then again in 52 BC, he attacked England and made England a part of the Roman Empire. And this rule of the Romans continued in England right up to 450, which means 400 years. It were the Romans who were ruling England. And obviously, it is their language, Latin, which was imposed. So Gaelic and Celtic, which were the earlier languages spoken and not written yet, because writing comes very late. They were the two languages on the island. But with the Romans' occupation of England, then Latin became the official language. And Latin had an added advantage because the Christian religion was born in Italy and it was the language of those people, which was Latin, that became the medium for all the religious books. The Bible was in Latin, and therefore it became very influential all over Europe, because very quickly Europe turned Christian, and all Christians would read the Bible and therefore would learn Latin. So Latin in England also continued to rule for 400 years. And the alphabets of English, which we use even today, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H up to Z, these alphabets came from Latin. That is why they are called Romans, Roman alphabets. So English didn't have its own alphabets at that time. It is these alphabets which were adopted in the entire Europe, in fact, by the French, by the British, by the Germans, so on and so forth. So Latin then replaced Celtic and Gaelic languages. And this continued, as I said, for 400 years, 450. It was in that year that the island was again attacked, this time by the Germanic tribes. These Germanic tribes were Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. These were the three German tribes which actually came from the southeast of Russia. Germany was not there as a nation as yet, and these German-speaking tribes, they came from southeast of Russia, and it is they who dislodged the Celts and the Gaels, and then of course the Romans. So Romans in 450 were replaced by these Germanic tribes. So they brought their own languages, and their languages were the dialects of German. So Angles, for example, had their own dialect, Saxons had their own dialect, Jutes had their own dialect. So there were several dialects of the German language. And it is these dialects then which became the official language of the people, because whoever rules, as I said, will impose his own language. So these languages then came to England, and that is why Angles being more powerful. The very name England comes from there. It was not originally there. It came from the Angles. The Angles gave it the name England. And similarly English. English also because the dialect of the Angles. So it became English. This was finally the name of the island as well as their language. This came about with these Germanic tribes, which means in the 5th century. Before 5th century, names were quickly changing from one to the other. And for example, the earlier name of England was Brittany. In the ancient times, its name was Brittany. That is why Britain, then it became Great Britain. And these now free states like Scotland, Ireland, Wales, they were always a part of that island, mainly England. So gradually the politics developed and they separated very late though, like Scotland separated from England in the 18th century and Ireland separated in the 20th century. So Wales, of course, again separated, and in Wales, parts of it, that Gaelic language, for example, is still spoken. In Ireland, Celtic, you see, language is still spoken in parts of it. So that is how languages survive. They obviously, as I said, survive in proportion to the power that its speakers enjoy. If the speakers of a particular language are the rulers, obviously it has an advantage. It will be imposed as official language. Like I gave the example of India, after the Muslims, when the British came, they replaced Persian by English. Then English became the official language of India. And every language, it may be Persian, it may be English, earlier Sanskrit, all these languages, they left behind their impact on the local languages of the people. India has 26 languages, whereas the entire Europe has only 13. And all these 26 languages at one time, in the ancient times, were the dialects of Sanskrit. But then later they developed into their own languages, because every group of people is aspirant to develop its own dialect, its own spoken language, and to have its own literature, its own stock of reading material and so on, and impatient to make it the official language of their state. That's why in different states of India we have different languages which are official languages of those states. So similarly in Europe, in England, that is how from the Celtic to Gaelic to English, some sort of English, means a mixture of the dialect of the Angles, dialect of Saxons, dialect of Jutes, all these dialects put together, along with the motherly influence of Latin. Out of these came out English. That is how English language was born. And it took quite some time for the language to become actually a language. If you remember, it was in the 14th century, in the age of Chaucer, when language called modern English, that took shape. It became a formal language to be written, to be read. So it was introduced in England during the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, there were only dialects. Like Chaucer, his dialect was Midland dialect. So even within London, there were several dialects spoken in different parts of the city. So it were the dialects actually, no official language called English until the 14th century. So it was there as late as 14th century that English matured into a formal language to be read, to be written, and the first writer actually we will have like Beowulf. Beowulf was the first long poem written in some sort of English, which we called Old English. So that long poem, that became a source of inspiration for other writers. There was Bede, for example. Bede was first writer, but he wrote his books in Latin. It was prestigious to write books in Latin even as late as 16th and 17th century. If you remember, Milton was in the 17th century. So even he wrote his early poetry in Latin because it was prestigious. Like in India, it is still prestigious to read, to speak, to write in English. because this was the language of the rulers. Similarly, in England, even until 17th century, it was considered a mark of superiority to write in Latin, to speak in Latin. So even writers like Milton, who was patriotic otherwise and very actively participating in the national politics, a friend of the Prime Minister, even he started writing in Latin. Later, of course, when he wrote Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, then he used English. So similarly, in Chaucer's time, and even in before Chaucer, before the death of Christ, ancient times, 1st century BC, we had this oldest poem, Beowulf. And after that, a lot of followers, they started. And Camden was, of course, the first who used English in poetry. And then, of course, literature in English started coming about. And it was Henry VII and then his son Henry VIII in the 15th and 16th century. They made English the official language of England. And it was then that it made a start as the language of the people to be read, to be written, in which literature was produced. So that is how English developed as a language. That is the origin of language called English. It is, in a way, an amalgamation, a combination, an integration of so many dialects and languages which were spoken by different tribes, which came at different times, centuries later, and they ruled England one after the other. Romans were the last to rule for 400 years. And after Romans, of course, the Angles and Saxons, these Germanic tribes, but Germanic tribes settled there. They became the natives of the place, just as the Muslims came here and they settled here. They became part of India. Now it is more than 1,000 years. So their language, their culture is a part of our national heritage. Similarly, in England, all these Germanic tribes, they settled there, and their languages in fact, and their cultures, they became a part of the national heritage of England. So that is the story of the origin of English language. Well, we take up now the next stage of the growth of English language and literature. And here comes what we call Anglo-Saxon period, which begins with 450. As I said, the invasion of the Germanic tribes, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, and they of course continued and settled there. It is their dialects which became languages, and an amalgamation, as I said, of all these dialects that finally evolved itself into the language we call English, and that became the official language of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, all these four now independent states, of course, at that time a part of the island of England, and all speaking the same language, English. It were these, and as I said, each language and dialect leaves its own impact on the life of the people, and life will include language, literature, culture, these three things primarily. Politics, of course, as we begin with Foucault's famous statement, power and knowledge. They are near allied, inseparably so, and it is power which determines the place of knowledge. That is why languages keep changing. Literatures come up in different languages depending upon the ruling, elite. Whoever is ruling will impose, as I said, her own language. So during this period, which we call Anglo-Saxon, because of these tribes, Angles and Saxons, these two were the dominant ones. So that period became the Anglo-Saxon period, and this continued up to 1066. So 450 to 1066, this is called the Anglo-Saxon periods. And this is the period of Old English. Then comes Middle English, and then comes Modern English. So up to 1066 it is Old English. Then 1066 to 1400 there is Middle English, where Chaucer also comes, medieval ages. And after 1400 comes Modern English. So that is how the growth of English takes place. And during this period, which we call Anglo-Saxon period, the language was Old English. And in this Old English, the first writing that came about was by a poet called Bede, Bede. He was the first poet in the language, and it was as late as 8th century. 8th. In 731, he produced a book called History of the English Church and People. History of the English Church and People. And this book was written in Latin, not actually in English. In English, simultaneously, at the same time, a contemporary of Bede was Caedmon, Caedmon, Caedmon. So Caedmon was actually the first one who used English in writing. So he wrote poetry in Old English. So the first poet of Old English was not Bede, because Bede wrote in Latin, it was Cadman. And his collection of poems, several volumes, it came to be titled Charms, Charms, Charms. And then came the followers of Cadman, and they also wrote in Old English. Why not our own language? So they were excited, they were enthusiastic, because no longer Latin now, they will be writing in their own language. Just as we felt excited when we started writing after independence in our own languages. Earlier, you had to use officially English language. Their also official language was Latin. It was only after this that they started writing using English. So Cadman was very influential, and there came a group of poets. They came to be known as the followers of Cadman, and they wrote then poems in Old English, in Anglo-Saxon dialect of English. And it is that poetry that is still known by the name of Cadman's followers. But the more important book in poetry that came out was the epic in Anglo-Saxon or Old English. That is Beowulf, Beowulf, Beowulf. So this is an epic poem. Epic poem is a long poem, just as we have the Ramayana and Mahabharata. These are our long poems. These are our epics. And epic poem is comprehensive of a people's life, their culture, and language also develops through such poems, long poems, because the writers of these poems, they are after all great writers, great poets, and they actually then make the language. In English, for example, later modern English was mostly created by Shakespeare, because until then there were dialects and dialects, and it is he who for the first time is creating the English language. Over 40,000 words he used in his plays. Imagine, no one in these 400 years has been able to use as many words. So he combined words, he coordinated words, he created words, and that is how English language was finally formed. But during this period, the Anglo-Saxon or the Old English period, to begin with, as I said, it was Bede, and the more important was Cadman, because Cadman was the first one to use Anglo-Saxon or Old English as the medium of writing, medium of poetry. Otherwise, before that, everybody was writing in Latin. So Cadman and his followers, they used for the first time Anglo-Saxon language and Old English. And Charms, as I said, was the name of the volume that came out. And after Cadman, there came another. His name resembles Beowulf, and he wrote. I'm sorry, Cynewulf, Cynewulf, Cynewulf. So he was the next major poet in Old English. But before that, before Cynewulf, I would like to speak about Beowulf because that is important. What happens in that long poem, the epic of Old English, epic of Anglo-Saxon English of that period. Now, in that long poem, there is the hero whose name is Grendel, Grendel, Grendel. And Grendel, as you know, in epic poems, it is battles, wars that take place, like Ramayana, Mahabharata. Again, on the west side, you have the Greek epics, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, just like our Ramayana and Mahabharata. So you have wars there. In Beowulf also, there are battles. There is a war that takes place. And this Grendel, the hero, he kills in the first part a monster, in the second a dragon. Even now, China, its symbol is dragon. So dragon actually refers to Asia, and monster refers to Africa, which means this Western hero conquers both Asia and Africa. So right from that period, the Old English period, the Anglo-Saxon period, you can see that consciously or unconsciously, that this was in the mind of the Europeans, the people of the West, including those living in England, that they wanted to conquer the world. Finally they did. The Europeans came to rule Asia as well as Africa, and that is why the whole world. In Julius Caesar, if you remember, the whole world is divided into 3 rulers. Antony is one of them, and Antony gets Asia. That's why he comes to Egypt, falls in love with Cleopatra, and so on. So they were ruling the whole world. First the Romans, and then these Anglo-Saxons. So Beowulf is that poem which shows you how ambitious these people were. Of course, every group of people is, every tribe is. Even in Ramayana and Mahabharata, if you remember, we talk of the world, we talk of ruling the entire world, and the hero there also conquers the whole world. Ram kills Ravan, and in Mahabharata the Pandavas and so on. So that is a part of it. In Beowulf, the same thing happens, but significant thing is, as I said, the monster and the dragon. They symbolize 2 continents, Asia and Africa. So their literature right from the beginning shows their ultimate ambition of ruling the world. And they did come to rule the world during those 200 years at least, 18th, 19th century and part of the 20th, 250 or 300 years. They ruled entire Africa, entire Asia, and all these were Europeans, and including America, Australia. They were ruling Canada. all the parts of the world. So, Old English, through the Anglo-Saxons, these Germanic tribes who brought their own dialects of German, and all these dialects, as I said, got absorbed into each other, they got integrated, and finally English emerged as a separate language. Earlier it was not there. Earlier it was just a set of dialects, n number of dialects, and each small group of people speaking its own dialect, not communicating with each other because there was no common language. But then communication is the prime need of any species. Birds speak with each other. Animals speak with their own species. We humans speak with each other. But then there are hundreds and thousands of languages and dialects in the world, because different human communities, small groups of people having their own languages, having their own dialects. That is why you have so many languages in the world, so many dialects of every language. And now, of course, with technology, you have writing, you have printing. But those days, there was no writing, no printing. And everything was either spoken or written later in hand. Even paper, if you remember, came about in 14th century. Before that, there was no paper. People were writing on the leaves of trees. In India also, if you go back to our Vedic literature, for example, that is written on these leaves of trees, no, not on paper. It was later that it was transferred on paper. Similarly, in Europe, before 14th century, you do not have any printing press. This was a German, by the way, who invented, and then of course printing started, books started, libraries started. But during this period of the Anglo-Saxon, we had only this much. And Beowulf, the most important poem, as I said, epic, this had this story of killing of the dragon and the monster, signifying symbolically Africa and Asia, and hence the whole world. So the followers of Cadman, as I said, came about, and Cynewulf, Cynewulf, was the next important poet. In fact, the second one after Cadman. Bede, of course, was a poet, but as I said, he wrote in Latin. So Cadman was the first to write in English, Old English. And then Cynewulf was the second great important poet who wrote in Old English poetry of his time. And the volume of poems collected, poems by Cynewulf and his followers, that is collected under the title The Exeter Book. Exeter, E-X-T-E-R, Exeter, E-X-E-T-E-R, Exeter Book. So that is a collection of poems of that period written in Old English. And it is from there that you get to know what kind of language was used. And by the way, in Beowulf as well as in this Exeter Book, the kind of poetry that you have, it doesn't have the rhyme scheme. Today you have rhyme you have definite meter, but at that time there was no rhyme. There was only alliterative verse. Alliterative means where you produce some sort of music by the combination of sounds, two sounds which are similar or two beats coming regularly one after the other. It is this kind of rhythm created in the lines of poetry that came to be known as alliterative verse. And poets at that time did not have meter or rhyme, and they were using only alliterative verse. And this alliterative verse, by the way, was forged from your own heartbeat and your breathing. So the pace of breathing and the pace of your heartbeat, they became the model for the rhythm in poetry. The alliterative verse that came out without meter, without rhyme, it was this rhythm which it followed. The natural rhythm of the heart, the natural rhythm of even the mind, it were these which became the model. And that is why at that time no rhymed verse, and what we call today the blank verse. So actually Old English had only, which later came to be called the blank verse. So the entire poetry in Old English or Anglo-Saxon English is written in unrhymed alliterative verse. And Cynewulf and his followers, they produced poems under the title The Exeter Book. And by the way, the famous poem King Arthur and the knights, you remember, his Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur and Knights of his Round Table, they became a model for heroism and for the sentiments. For example, their sentiment for creating an ideal society, a utopian society. Plato, 2000 years ago, more than that, he had written the Republic, which again is nothing but imagining an ideal society, an ideal state. How should people live together? How should they be governed? And what should be their occupations, their different engagements, and so on. So similarly here you have King Arthur and the Knights of his Round Table. If you remember Spenser, Edmund Spenser in his Faerie Queene, he is imitating this very poem, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, because in the Faerie Queene also, in those 12 books, in every book there is a separate hero. Here also there is a separate hero, and every book is in a way complete by itself in terms of the tale or the story or the plot. At the same time, there are interlinkages between and among the different books of this long poem, the 12 books. So that was the model. Beowulf provided that model, and then Cynewulf, his own Exeter book, that provided the model, and it was this literature that came about. By the way, in 9th century AD, you had King Alfred ruling England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. And it was in the 9th century that prose in Old English came about. Before that, you do not have any writing in prose. You have writing in poetryons. So English prose was born in the 9th century, in the reign of King Alfred. And it was here that books on religion, philosophy, they came to be written, even Bible. It came to be translated into English. Earlier, nobody was even allowed to translate. If you remember, people were done to death if you translate it into any other language except Latin. So the sanctity of it, just as Sanskrit could not, our Vedic literature could not be translated into any other language for many, many centuries. It was only later that it was allowed to be done so. Similarly here. So that is the story of Old English and literature that is available, and how the poetry came up first and prose came up later in the 9th century. And this period continued, as I said, up to 1066, until the time the French-speaking invaders came, and then the story changes to Anglo-Norman and so on. So I think enough for the day, and thank you for listening to these two talks, allied but separate too.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very productive session. I hope that all the students who might have watched us would be benefited from this particular lecture. So, dear friends, if you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback regarding this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in, and very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you, so that it becomes easier and convenient for you to access this lecture the number of times you wanted. So, dear friends, we would be meeting again tomorrow, and tomorrow we would be discussing on the Anglo-Norman period. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.